Good morning and afternoon, everyone. Before we get started, I wanted to make an announcement about an upcoming program at the library. On December the 8th, that's a Friday at 6 p.m., we will be hosting a library holiday open house, and I hope y'all can come be a part of that. It's Friday, December the 8th at 6 p.m. We're going to have some excellent entertainment. We're going to have the Saltillo Elementary School Choir on hand to serenade us with some holiday tunes. We also have lined up a dramatic reading of "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" by Carlton Wall. I believe many of y'all know Carlton. And also a poetry reading by Asia Rainey. Capped off the evening with a Christmas tree lighting downstairs and then reception to follow. So it should be a good evening here at the library during the holidays with all of our friends. It's Friday, December the 8th at 6 p.m. Hope y'all can come. Thank you. Margaret.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming out today. And if we ran out of sandwiches, it's my fault. So I apologize. Glenn packs them in. Our reviewer today is Judge Glen Davidson. He was born in Pontotoc, Mississippi, and he earned a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Mississippi and a Juris Doctorate from the University of Mississippi. He was a city prosecutor for Tupelo in 1965. He was a United States Air Force captain with the JAG Corps, and then he entered private practice here in Tupelo. He was part-time assistant attorney of the 1st Judicial District of Mississippi and a district attorney of 1st Judicial District of Mississippi in 1975. He was a United States Attorney for the Northern District of Mississippi from 1981 to 1985. I hope none of you had ever had to go before him. But anyway, on July the 23rd, 1985, Glenn was nominated by President Ronald Reagan to a new seat on the United States District Court for the Northern District of Mississippi. And he was confirmed by the United States Senate on October 17, 1985, and he served as Chief Judge from 2000 to 2007, and he took senior status on June the 1st, 2007. Glenn, welcome to the library and Lunching with Books. He's a great supporter of the library, and we're very pleased to have him here to review this most interesting book. Thank you.
I want to make a couple of introductions before I start. We have our Chief Deputy United States Marshal for this district, and Mr. Woodruff and Mr. Rambo, Deputy United States Marshal, are with us today. And a very special introduction. The young lady here at the first table is served as my law clerk for 6 years. Gina Kelly Smith, her husband's pastor of Nettleton Baptist Church. I want to tell you this, she has a daughter, a little daughter 2 years old, and it just got a little too rambunctious for her working with me full time and with the daughter, so she left me, just about 4 or 5 months ago. Gina, is that? It hasn't been that long. Yeah, okay, well she's recently left me, and she's now employed by a law firm, Lidler Mendelson, which is a 1,000-man law firm, and she is allowed to work from home. She reports to an office in Birmingham, but they've got offices all over the world, and it's that's progress, something that's developed with the internet. She's permitted to work from home and stay with that baby, and yet is employed by a 1,000-man law firm. And, you know, I don't know, those law firms need representatives in Brewer, Mississippi. She's the only lawyer they have in Brewer community. The subject I have today is just, we could stay here till dark. Honorable James O. Eastland, at one time he was, towards the end of his tenure, he was President Pro Tem of the United States Senate. That meant he was third in line for the presidency if in the event of the death of the president. I want to start this with a quote, and many around him knew that he recognized his need to accommodate to accumulate political capital to allow him to get what he wanted in terms of agriculture programs to benefit his state's farmers and nominations for judges deemed worthy on the federal bench by his colleagues. One who sensed a very real pragmatic streak was Robert F. Kennedy. Kennedy, this is a quote from Kennedy, "You register those people to vote," he told Martin Luther King Jr. in the early 1960s, "and Jim Eastland will change his mind." Now that's what Robert Kennedy had to say about the civil rights era and Senator Eastland. He did not have the flair of the segregationists Vardaman, Bilbo, Ross Barnett, and George Wallace. What Senator Eastland went about, he was so effective, he was pretty quiet, but he accomplished a lot. And what he's most known for is the obstructionist of civil rights progress, civil rights legislation. There's no question he was a segregationist. In today's terms, looking back, he's probably correctly defined as a racist. But that's the world he grew up in. That's the world he knew. Eastland's grandfathers kind of set the tone for his development. One of his grandfathers, Oliver Eastland. Now, there are a couple of things that really surprised me in this book. I always put Senator Eastland in the Delta, Dodgeville, Rouville, the Mississippi Delta. He actually, he was born in the Delta because his father was over there running that plantation for a couple of years due to some family problems. Woods Eastland, Senator Eastland's father, was a very, very prominent attorney, very successful personal injury attorney, a railroad attorney, represented railroads. But he was in Forest, Mississippi, over in the eastern part of the state, halfway between Jackson and Meridian in the Piney Woods belt. And that is actually where the Eastland family was from. Now, one of his grandfathers, Oliver Eastland, was known at that time as a pharmacist. He developed something called Eastland's antiseptic, a patent medicine. Had 3 drugstores. They were all in Scott County near Forest. But that patent medicine, that's where the Eastland money came from. They didn't own an acre of land in the Delta at the turn of the century. His grandfather sold that patent medicine, and he sold the patent to Tishner family in New Orleans. Dr. Tishner's. Okay, that originated with Oliver Eastland from Forest, Mississippi, and that family retained a royalty on every bottle of Dr. Tishner's medicine that was sold in the United States. That's where the money came from. Rather than invest the money in railroad bonds, other investments possible at that period in the late 19th century, 1890 up to 1910, this grandfather Oliver Eastland invested the money in Delta land around Dodgeville, Mississippi. He was not necessarily a farmer, but he very acutely and intelligently invested in land in the Delta. Some of that land at that time, it was selling for $1 an acre. Most he ever paid for any of this grandfather was $5 an acre. So during his lifetime, he accumulated 2,400 acres of land near Doddsville, Mississippi. His father went to Ole Miss Law School and was a very, very successful attorney, but they had that Delta land. Now, James O. Eastland was born in Doddsville in a house of the residence of the local doctor over there, Dr. Coleman. And he was there. His dad was just there for like 2 or 3 years managing that farm, but still maintaining his law practice in Oxford. His brother, James Eastland, who Senator Eastland was named for, was murdered. And that's why Woods Eastland wound up over in the Delta for a few years. He was indicted for killing the man who killed his brother. He was tried in Sunflower County, was brought to court in Sunflower County, and the judge directed a verdict in his favor. And that was one of those old sore spots in Mississippi history where a white man was charged with killing a black man. That case was thrown out. It didn't affect Woods Eastland's law practice, but that's a sore spot in their family history. Senator Eastland never told his children about it until Woods Eastland was over at the law school at Ole Miss, and some of his classmates asked him about it. He asked his father, and his father confirmed it was true. But his other grandfather was Captain Richmond Austin, who fought under Robert E. Lee at Gettysburg for the Confederacy. After Gettysburg, he was assigned to staff of General Nathan Bedford Forrest here in this area and finished out the Civil War as an officer in the Confederate Army. And it's from that grandfather that Eastland's mother was a real leader, state president of the Daughters of the Confederacy. And it was through that, his maternal side of the family, that he heard so much about the horrors of Reconstruction, the horrors of Reconstruction. And really, Senator Eastland and practically all of the political leaders in the Confederate States at that time saw this civil rights development in the 1950s and 1960s as the second Reconstruction. And I think that's why he justified fighting civil rights so vigorously. He was born in Doddsville. Before he started to school, his family moved back to Forrest. And he grew up and went to high school in Forrest, which is a hill county. Scott County is a hill county, and you know, small farms just like Lee and Pontotoc, Lee-Itawamba. That allowed him to have a much better understanding of the hill country of Mississippi. This is so diverse from a delta. Now, during Woods Eastland's life, Eastland's father, he accumulated more land in Doddsville, adjoining land, and during his lifetime, that plantation got to be 5,800 acres. Now, that's a plantation that Senator Eastland moved to and lived on in Doddsville, Mississippi, 5,800 acres. He had 400 sharecrop families that lived there and farmed his land, 400. But Woods Eastland took a great interest in his son James because he was the only child. James went to high school in Forrest. He had friends and whatnot, you know, lesser well-to-do friends, and grew up in a typical hill country town. Now, one thing, and that gives me a better understanding of Mississippi politics, I didn't know this. I knew that Scott County was famous, Bill, for judges. Judge Percy Lee, Judge Roy Noble Lee were both, that's a father-son, were both Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. And my colleague and classmate Tom Stewart Lee is a federal district judge in the Southern District. They are from Forrest. I always thought of Forrest as the home of the judiciary, of the judges. In this book, I learned for the first time in Scott County, I didn't know this. Paul Johnson Sr. grew up in Forrest in Scott County, and he and Woods Eastland roomed together at a small college down there, Harpersville College in Scott County. I didn't know this. The Hedeman family is from Scott County. The owners of the Clarion Ledger grew up in Scott County, classmates of Jim Eastland in high school. The McMullen family is from Forest. The family that found and principal owners of Deposit Guarantee Bank in Jackson were from Forest. And all that intertwined, all these connections throughout Senator Eastland's career. When Pat Harrison, one of the most respected and influential members of the United States Senate, died in 1941, Paul Johnson Sr. was governor. Speaking of respected and renowned people, Dr. Tudor, you came in just the right time. Somebody get Dr. Forrest Tudor a seat. Forrest and Janice. Forrest, I was just talking about very influential people. The owner of Lochinvar. When Pat Harrison, one of the most respected members of the United States Senate, died in 1941. Now, Pat Harrison at that time was chairman of the Senate's Finance Committee and President pro tem of the United States Senate. He had missed being elected majority leader of the Senate by one vote. The other Senator Bilbo didn't vote for him. He would have been majority leader of the United States Senate had Bilbo voted for him. He didn't. They hated each other. Bilbo very much resented that all of the federal patronage, and this was during FDR's administration, went to Harrison. Harrison had all of the patronage in Mississippi, Bilbo none. And Bilbo hated it. But now in 1936, Look magazine had a survey of all the correspondents in Washington to name the most influential senator in the United States Senate, and it was nearly unanimous, Pat Harrison from Mississippi. Then named the least influential senator in the United States Senate, it was almost unanimous, Theodore G. Bilbo. And so that's the culture that Senator Eastland, Paul B. Johnson Sr. called his college roommate, Woods Eastland, and he said, I've got to set a special election and appoint an interim to represent Mississippi in Pat Harrison's seat. Woods, would you take that job? Now, he couldn't appoint his son. Paul B. Johnson Jr. was in the Marine Corps in the Pacific. Woods Eastland said, Paul, I'm too old. I'm getting close to 60, and I just don't want to do that. And I'm not, I don't think, but I would appreciate it if you would appoint my son Jim. Now, Jim Eastland was 37 years old at the time. Out of college, he had served one term in the Mississippi State House of Representatives, was elected when he was 23. And at that time, Bilbo was governor, and Jim Eastland and Courtney Pace were known in the state capitol as Bilbo's lieutenants. They helped Bilbo with a lot of this progressive legislation, free textbooks, schools, streets, brick roads, and whatnot. Eastland was really helpful to Bilbo and cooperated with him. But Bilbo absolutely did not want him appointed to the United States Senate for that short tenure before a special election was called, and let Governor Johnson know it. Now, let me interject this. Does anybody know where Bilbo graduated from college? Eastland graduated from college, where his degree is from? He had no college degree. He went to Ole Miss, made excellent grades in history, English, political science, everything except mathematics. When it got time for him to take the mathematics courses to fulfill his degree requirements, he transferred. He transferred to Vanderbilt. At that time, you went to undergraduate school and law school and got your LLB degree It was not, you didn't, a BA degree was not required to get into law school. Well, he transferred to Vanderbilt Law School, and his dad kind of encouraged that because Vanderbilt Law School used the casebook method to study law, which I suppose about all law schools do now, but Ole Miss used a textbook method. And his father, Woods Eastland, thought it would be better for him to go to law school at Vanderbilt. Well, he took all of the required courses, did excellent in the required courses except math. He didn't take the first math course. When it got time for him to take that math course, he transferred to the University of Alabama. I didn't know you could do that. But he never received a degree from any college. He went, after his experience at Alabama, he went to his dad's law office and read law as an apprentice, and then took the state bar and made one of the highest grades ever on the state bar. But he never took the first course in mathematics in any college, and he never got a degree. That's a little interesting note. Now, his wife was a math teacher. But right after being admitted to the bar at age 23, he ran for and was elected a member of the House of Representatives in Mississippi and represented that Hill County, Forest. That's where he was elected from. In 1937, when it got time to appoint the senator to Pat Harrison's term, Paul Johnson appointed Jim Eastland to the United States Senate at age 37. He was criticized for that Eastland was so young, but Eastland promised him he wouldn't run for the remainder of Pat Harrison's term. Eastland served 88 days as a result of that appointment from Paul Johnson Sr. Now, everyone thought he would be just a figurehead, a caretaker for that short period of time. He was not. He jumped right into work with the United States Senate, went to work every morning at 7 in the morning, worked until 9 o'clock at night. And that was when the Second World War had broken out in 1942. And part of the Roosevelt administration was the War Price Administration. You had this office, an administrative appointee who established prices for all commodities during the war. And he put the prices of cotton and cotton seed at such a low price, there was no way farmers could grow cotton profitably, couldn't make anything. So Eastland worked and he stayed on that price control department and got those prices lifted. And he worked just tirelessly during those 88 days for farmers. Okay, he did not run for the special election. Walt Doxey from Holly Springs ran. John Rankin ran for that office at that time, 1942. But Walt Doxey was elected to serve out the remainder of Pat Harrison's term. And the way he conducted himself in the Senate is he did what Bilbo told him to do, the senior senator. Bilbo loved it. And see, Bilbo got that patronage that Harrison had for that 15-month period. And when Bilbo knew that Eastland made no bones about it. He loved the Senate. He wanted to run for the full term, the full 6-year term, and he did. But Bilbo fought him every way in the world. There were 3 people in that race, and Walt Doxey and Jim Eastland and a fellow named Randall Wall, who had been head of something like a Farmers Home Administration or something. But anyway, the runoff was against Doxey and Eastland. In reality, it was a runoff between Eastland and Bilbo. Bilbo spent full time in the state trying to help Walt Doxey get elected. Now, in this book, it states that 2 people Jim Eastland could always count on being against him in anything he did. One was Theodore G. Bilbo, who died in 1947, The other was Waldox's outspoken niece. Okay, y'all tell me who that was. Sarah Doxy Tate, who was a member of this organization. She opposed Jim Eastland for the rest of his career and anything he ran for, anything he did. And she was outspoken. I remember here in Tupelo, Sarah Doxy Tate. That's Waldox's niece. Eastland was elected during the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration. Senator McClellar from McKellar, Kellar, from Tennessee, kind of took him under his wing. McKellar at that time was chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Eastland's first assignments in the Senate were exactly what he wanted, judiciary and agriculture. And he kept those assignments throughout his career and was very effective. McKellar took him to the White House to be introduced to FDR, and Roosevelt rolled his wheelchair up to Eastland and said, "Yeah, I remember you. You are the man who gave my Price man so much hell when you were up here before." I said, "I remember you." He said, "I tell you what, if you want anything, if there's anything I can do for you, you call me and I'll give you 10 minutes of my time, and if at all possible, I'll give you what you want. Now, the only thing I want you to do is when I give you that 10 minutes, you give me 30 minutes, and I'll tell you how you can help me." That was Franklin Roosevelt to Jim Eastland. Basically, he got along. He really supported Roosevelt in all matters involving foreign policy, the war effort. Pretty much agreeable with Roosevelt. Some of the things, social legislation he might have opposed, but of course, he fought anybody on civil rights throughout these first 3 decades of his career. One place he ran into a snag with Roosevelt is Roosevelt was pretty active in assuring that all members of the armed forces could vote an absentee ballot. Well, that really put him in conflict with the people in the old Confederate states because, see, we required a poll tax and this crazy test on the Constitution to be registered to vote. And of course, what that did, it prevented any blacks from registering. But now the first blacks that got to vote in Mississippi elections were people who were on active duty in the armed forces in World War II. Roosevelt just insisted if they can fight, they can vote. And so they were permitted to vote, but the numbers were not very great at all. When they came home and out of service, then they couldn't vote. That literacy test was just nuts. How many bubbles in a soap bar? Stuff like that. Some of these circuit clerks would ask. And, the $2 poll tax, that was a real imposition on poor families. But that was just to prevent Afro-Americans from voting. Now, in the Eisenhower administration, I'm skipping Truman. Eastland supported Truman in all foreign affairs, in the conduct of the war, the Korean War and so forth. He supported him in dropping the atomic bombs on Japan. But there again, where he got crossed up with Eastland was in civil rights. See, Truman totally integrated the armed forces. He did away with his black units, white units, and so forth. All the units in the armed forces under Truman were integrated. And of course, Eastland fought that. And Truman also started to introduce civil rights bills, which Eastland objected to. And in the election of 1948, Eastland had very much helped Truman get nominated for vice president. Roosevelt's last year, the choices were Harry Truman from Missouri and Henry Wallace, who was probably the most liberal person who had served one term as Roosevelt's vice president. But Truman was nominated for vice president over Henry Wallace. That convention was pretty well thrown open. But the office of vice president under Franklin Roosevelt was just about zip. Truman didn't even know about the Manhattan Project. He didn't know about the development of the atomic bombs. So much he didn't know until Roosevelt died. But there again, the only conflicts that Eastland had with Truman involved civil rights bills. In 1948 was the only time that Eastland did not support the National Democratic Party. That was the year you had that Dixiecrat thing, and Strom Thurmond was nominated for president and Fielding Wright was nominated for vice president. And that's the only time Eastland left the National Democratic Party. And that, you see, was before he was chairman of the Judiciary Committee. He was made chairman of the Judiciary Committee towards the end of Eisenhower's administration in 1958. Once he got that chairmanship, from there on, he supported the Democratic ticket, even against Goldwater in 1964. Eisenhower administration, Truman had a jewel in that administration named Ezra Taft Benson, the Secretary of Agriculture. Benson helped Mississippi cotton farmers, southern farmers, tremendously. He came down to Cleveland, Mississippi, and spoke to the Delta Council, and was a really close friend of James O. Eastland, and helped farmers every way he could. That was a plus in the Eisenhower administration. Of course, you had the integration of Central High School in Little Rock, and that was the beginning of all this turmoil with integrated schools. Of course, Eastland fought that, as did Sparkman and Richard Russell in Georgia, all of the southern senators and congressmen. He got through the Eisenhower administration. Those last years of Ike's term, Eisenhower nominated Earl Warren for Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Eastland, among about 10 others, voted against him. He said Warren did not have judicial experience, and he didn't. He was governor of California, Republican governor. He'd been Attorney General of California. But Earl Warren was confirmed, and nobody had any idea that Warren would be as activist as he came to be. Later on, Eastland was very critical of Warren. Now, this was during the time that Joseph McCarty, Senator McCarty, was having all these witch hunts in Congress about the communists and whatnot. Well, Eastland was appointed by McClellan as chairman of the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee. Now, whatever that was, it didn't exist before he was appointed the chairman of that subcommittee. What he did, he just took a great aggressive action and had subpoena power to try to connect NAACP, COFO, Students Nonviolent Movement, all these civil rights organizations to the Communist Party. That's what Eastland tried to do through that Senate Internal Security Subcommittee. Tried to make the civil rights organization all connected to the Communist Party. Of course, he didn't have much success with that, but he was, and McClellan had named, before Eastland became chairman of the Judiciary Committee, he'd been appointed also chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee Subcommittee on Civil Rights. And McClellan, see, was from Tennessee. Well, what happened, just civil rights bills just didn't come out of that subcommittee, and they didn't go to the full Judiciary Committee. It delayed and impeded and obstructed civil rights legislation effectively. Now, during the Eisenhower administration, there was a civil rights bill passed in 1957 that was so watered down before that Judiciary Committee got finished with it, several of the northern senators stated, by reading this bill, it appears that Robert E. Lee won and Ulysses S. Grant lost. And another interesting thing about the 1957 Civil Rights Bill, Brownell was Eisenhower's Attorney General. There was never the first case brought in the state of Mississippi to enforce civil rights under that act, 1957 Act. John Kennedy became president in the election of 1960. Of course, Kennedy advocated significant civil rights legislation. Eastland was pretty successful getting it bottled up as chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He did accommodate Kennedy on his appointments to the United States Supreme Court. I suppose most notably Justice White, Wizard White, was appointed by Kennedy. And at the time, it was thought he was a real conservative, not a conservative, moderate judge, if anything, on the liberal side. Well, over the years, he became one of the conservatives on the United States Supreme Court, appointed by John Kennedy. He was a deputy attorney general, a professional football player, Wizard White, and he just died a few years ago, 3, 4, 5 years ago. Pardon? Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Now the other one, notably, was Thurgood Marshall, was appointed to the United States Supreme Court during Kennedy. No, he was appointed to the District of Columbia Appellate Court during Kennedy's administration, and I believe he was elevated to the Supreme Court. No, he was elevated to the Supreme Court during Johnson's administration. Yeah. When Kennedy, one interesting thing, when Kennedy was assassinated, Eastland and all these other Southern senators knew what lay ahead on this obstructionist business with civil rights. Eastland said, Lyndon Johnson is another Franklin Roosevelt when it comes to working with Congress. What he wants, he'll get. And that proved to be true. Probably the most significant legislation as far as civil rights is concerned in the history of the United States was passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. When the blacks could vote, that changed the whole tenor of the United States, the landscape. Basically, this goes back to the 1956 nominating convention when young John Kennedy's name was put forward to vice president, and Estes Kefauver was, and Gower was, and whatnot. The Mississippi delegation of the J.P. Coleman voted first for Gower, and then when he fell out, it came down the last two men were Kefauver and Kennedy. And the Mississippi delegation under J.P. Coleman voted for Kennedy. And that set the relationship between so many, I would say between J.P. Coleman, John Stennis, James O. Eastland, and the Kennedy family, a friendship that endured through all of their careers. One other quote I'm going to read here that I think is significant during the Kennedy administration. What Eastland's got J.P. Coleman, Lyndon Johnson nominated J.P. Coleman for judgeship on the Fifth Circuit. Of course, he got opposition saying he was a racist and whatnot. By our terms, by any terms, J.P. Coleman was a moderate. And when he came up for nomination in Eastland's committee, Eastland helped him every way he could in the Judiciary Committee, but he said once he got the vote in the committee, there were only two liberals that voted against him. Philip Hart and Jacob Javits cast their lot against Coleman in the committee. Once the nomination reached the floor, Eastland let the senator who knew him best manage his confirmation. That member was Robert F. Kennedy, who had dealt with Coleman on matters affecting the Freedom Riders and the showdown at Ole Miss, and sensed that Coleman was not just wise in advising him not to trust Governor Ross Barnett. Eastland Coleman, Stennis, Jamie Whitten told Robert F. Kennedy and John F. Kennedy, don't rely on anything Ross Barnett tells you. And that was really critical during the Ole Miss debacle, and it proved to be true. Okay, since that Coleman was not just wise in advising him not to trust Governor Ross Barnett, but was also a man of his word. More than anyone alive, Robert Kennedy could reassure skeptics that Coleman would be guided by the law rather than any lingering attachment to the remnants of the antebellum South. His words assured that only 8 liberal idealists opposed Coleman on the Senate floor, and he was confirmed with 42 yeas and 8 nays for his judgeship on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. But when John Kennedy was assassinated, those people knew that what was coming with Lyndon Johnson. The Great Society, which some of it Eastland opposed. If it helped farmers, he was for it. But Johnson, LBJ, was successful in getting that Civil Rights Bill of 1965 passed. And that's the bill that you could send federal registrars into these counties and register blacks. And that was done all over the South. Eastland called Nicholas Katzenbach, who had become Attorney General after Robert Kennedy was elected to the Senate, and said, General Katzenbach, these people are down here on my farm trying to register these people to vote. He said, I want them off my farm, and I'm fixing to charge every one of them a trespass and put them in jail. And so Katzenbach thought for a while, and he said, Senator Eastland, why don't you just take those people up to the county registrar yourself? You know they're all going to vote for you, people working on his farm. And Eastland thought a while, and he did it. He took every black working on his farm up to the county courthouse in Indianola and got them registered to vote. Now, all the blacks in Sunflower County and one other adjoining county down there went to the, they had been told that it was impossible to register to vote. They'd tried it in years past, went to the county registrar and registered. There was never a single registrar ever came. I think the other county was Belzona, Humphreys County. Those federal registrars never came into those 2 counties. No suit was filed. Now, they did in a lot of other counties in Mississippi, but that Eastland just, the Katzenbach was right. He registered them, they all voted for Eastland, and everybody lived happily ever after. But the registrars did not come on his farm. Now, that was in '65. Something very notable happened in Mississippi politics in 1964. That's when Goldwater ran, and Goldwater carried this straight big time against Lyndon Johnson, Barry Goldwater. Well, Prentice Walker was a congressman who rode in on the coattails of Goldwater in 1964. He defeated a 6-term congressman, Arthur Winstead. And Prentice Walker, he's kind of like some other people that kind of fields his oats. He thought because he could beat Arthur Winstead and Barry Goldwater was still around, that he could beat Jim Eastland. Well, that didn't happen. I need to go back for just a minute. Eastland's first opponent of any significance was Carroll Garton in 1954. Now, I didn't realize this. I didn't know who voted against Hugh White. I was such a young child, I didn't know. But Paul B. Johnson ran against Hugh White for governor. He's a 36-year-old assistant United States attorney. And, of course, Eastland always supported Johnson. He said a political debt is never paid, and that's the man, his father, first appointed me to the Senate. Well, Carroll Garton, one of the things he criticized Eastland for his attendance, and it's crazy. These people from the right, it's kind of like today, people from the right attacking people. You know, Charles Evans said, "You're not going to out-segregate Jim Eastland." It's crazy. But when Garton ran against him, of course, Garton was at school, Hugh White, J.P. Coleman, Carroll Garton. Courtney Pace, who was Eastland's head chief of staff the whole time he was in the Senate, these people were shrewd. He went to Everett Dirksen. There was no Republican running when Carroll Garton was. He said, "Would you please write a letter saying that Senator Eastland is the worst obstructionist, the greatest delayer, and the biggest impediment in the United States to civil rights legislation? Would you please do that?" And Dirksen said, "You dictate the letter on my stationery and I'll sign it." So he did that. You know, just called Eastland this terrible segregationist. Well, Eastland used it down here in Mississippi. Copies of that letter, had thousands of them printed to show where he stood on segregation. Now, in this race against Prentice Walker, Walker tried to attack Eastland from the right, that he was not conservative enough. They always said he was too close a friend to the Kennedys. That's what they used to run against Eastland. He's too close to the Kennedys. Well, in that race in 1966, Eastland was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and he got Philip Hart from Michigan, who was a liberal Democrat, to personally attack him during a committee hearing about being such an obstructionist and so effective in bottling up civil rights and delaying all of the civil rights. And Sam Ervin jumped up and said, "You can't attack the member personally, and particularly the chairman." Eastland turned to Sam Ervin and said, "Sam, sit down and shut up. You're running the whole thing." And of course, what he wanted to do is take a transcript of that hearing down here to Mississippi to show how conservative he was. Anyway, Eastland got 70% of the vote, and Prentice Walker got about 36%. Lyndon Johnson had that debacle with Abe Fortas and Homer Thornberry. Fortas was already on the Supreme Court. Lyndon Johnson wanted to elevate him to Chief Justice when Earl Warren died, and he wanted to, in his place, name a good friend of mine, Homer Thornberry, as an associate justice. Judge Thornberry was on the Fifth Circuit all the time. He'd been in Congress for years and years. I talked with him while he was a circuit judge, and he would always get me over in the corner and want to know how Jamie Whitten was doing, and he knew Tom Abernathy and John Rankin, all these people from Mississippi. He'd served about 10 terms in the House of Representatives before he was appointed to the Fifth Circuit. But that Fortas, you know, in those hearings, to elevate him to the Chief Justice, it was developed that he was paid a fee while he was a justice on the United States Supreme Court for representing a client that he had prior to his appointment. He was still doing legal work for that client, getting paid. He would have never been appointed to the court had that become known when he was appointed an associate justice. But he sure was not elevated to Chief Justice and had to resign. But now all of this occurred just right at the end of Johnson's term. And it's kind of the thing we got into this last year. He was going out of office and Richard Nixon was coming in office. And the Republicans felt that Nixon should make that appointment, not Johnson. So those two appointments, when Nixon became president, were vacant. And Nixon it was a tough appointment because there was a lot of hard feelings and whatnot, but that's when Warren Burger, Chief Justice of the of the First Circuit, was appointed Chief Justice of the United States. And to fill that Fortas vacancy on the First Circuit bench, first they went to Clement Hainsworth from North Carolina, and that was not fair. Hainsworth stayed on the Fourth Circuit for years and years, an excellent judge, but he couldn't pass the muster in the Judiciary Committee at that time. He owned some stock in a corporation that he'd ruled on a case in that corporation, and that's totally forbidden. If I own one share of Walmart stock, I can't sit in a case involving Walmart. I haven't done it, but a lot of judges went out and bought Walmart stock for that reason. And that Carswell from Florida, he couldn't pass. He wasn't qualified. Now, that's who Nixon came to first. And then, on Berger's advice, they wound up appointing Harry Blackmun of Minnesota to that seat on the United States Supreme Court on Berger's recommendation. The Minnesota twins, Berger and Blackmun. And see, it wasn't long after that that the winds of Watergate began to blow. And Eastland supported Nixon as long as he could. The next opposition that Nixon had in an election was 1972, Gil Carmichael, and that was a legitimate opponent. But Nixon was president, and the Democrats had nominated George McGovern. Well, Eastland never publicly endorsed Nixon, but he never publicly endorsed McGovern. And everybody that knows anything about it's certain that Nixon did not oppose Eastland, and you'd think vice versa, Eastland would probably have voted for Nixon. That's something nobody will know. But in that election against Carmichael, that's another one where the National Republican Party did absolutely nothing to support Carmichael. They gave him money of $150,000, which was penance. And Eastland had about 5 times as much money to run that race as Carmichael did. Spiro Agnew, who was vice president at the time, came to Jackson and made a speech. There were 3,400 people. He was on the lawn of the old Capitol. Sitting behind him on the dais was Trent Lott and Thad Cochran, who were running for Congress in 1972 for the first time. They wouldn't let Gil Carmichael on the stand. Gil Carmichael was in a hotel room across the street watching them. They did nothing to endorse Carmichael. And in that election, of course, Nixon carried Mississippi against McGovern about 3-1. Eastland on the Democratic ticket got 3 times the number of votes that McGovern got. And Carmichael, Eastland got 58% of the vote that election. And that's the most votes any Republican ever got. And of course, that's developed over the years now, a total turnaround. With Watergate, Eastland defended Nixon as long as he could, and finally thing fell through with those tapes and whatnot, and the truth kind of came out about Richard Nixon. Eastland's tenure with Gerald Ford was cordial. Ford had a long-time history as a representative from Michigan. The senators, both Stennis and Eastland, got along fine with Gerald Ford. Ford made one appointment to the United States Supreme Court. John Paul Stevens, who at the time was a professor at the University of Chicago Law School, Eastland thought he was too liberal, but he did have some pretty good conservative credentials before he was appointed. He came on the Supreme Court and served decades and wound up being a part of the liberal bloc. Now, you never know, because Kennedy thought that Whizzer White was going to be real liberal, and he proved not to be. Ronald Reagan thought Justice Kennedy, who's on the Supreme Court now, was going to be a real conservative, and that's very questionable. Harry Blackmun, Nixon appointed, was supposed to be conservative, and he wasn't. And probably the best example of that is when George H.W. Bush appointed Souter from New Hampshire, and Souter wound up being one of the most liberal judges. You just don't know when people have those lifetime appointments, they're going to do what they think's right. and are not going to adhere to any political philosophy. Now, his relationship with John Stennis through all these decades was cordial, honest. They accommodated each other so well. Eastland came into the Senate in '42 for that full term. Stennis was not elected until 1947 and started serving in '48. But then when Nixon, Nixon on those Watergate tapes came forward with a proposal that we let John Stennis listen to him first and then let Stennis make a transcript. He tried to do that. Stennis was so revered and respected in the Senate. But he and Eastland were very effective. I always heard that you go to Senator Stennis and he'll tell you how to get it done, what steps to go through to get it done, and you go to Senator Eastland and he'll do it. And I think there's a lot of accuracy in that. Eastland could really cut through the red tape. Throughout his entire 36 years and 88 days, that's how long he served, he kept the same staff. Courtney Pace was his chief of staff. Courtney Pace went into the Mississippi State Legislature with him when they were both 23 years old and stayed with him through his entire time in the Senate. Bill Simpson and Clarence Pierce were two aides that stayed with him throughout his entire tenure, and they were both for many, many years members of the Mississippi Legislature and would work for Eastland full-time when the legislature was not in session. John Holloman was counsel for the Judiciary Committee for practically the entire time that Eastland was in the Senate, and he kept the same secretary, Ms. Allen, Jean Allen, was with him for the entire 36 years. And that speaks well of a man who has the exact same staff for all those years. A fellow, Jimmy Ziegler, worked for him. Ziegler was a fellow who was not from Mississippi. He was in law school at night at George Washington, and he needed a job, worked for Eastland, and he was real successful, later clerk for Justice Blackmun on the United States Supreme Court, and became a very successful attorney in Washington. But he tells the story. Now, Eastland's office, let me say this is the first thing I should have said. I talked to this author, Lee Annis, for an hour Monday, and he said what got him interested in this project was Eastland's civility and his being a mentor to the younger senators, helping the younger people who were elected and getting them knowledge of the rules and the ropes and how to conduct themselves to be successful. And this author, Annis, says that just does not exist today. And his civility. He would tell these people, Philip Hart, Everett Dirksen, Jacob Javits, you know I can't vote for that. That's civil rights. Bobby Kennedy one time brought Burt Marshall around. He was going to be appointed head of the Civil Rights Division in the Justice Department to meet Jim Eastland, chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Eastland said, now, Marshall will make it, but you know I'm going to have to vote against him. He was just up front and told these people the civil rights issues, I'm going to have to vote against it, you understand that, but I'll let it through. He told Burt Marshall, said, I wouldn't vote for Jesus Christ if he was nominated for that job. Chairman of the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, he didn't care who you nominated, he was against it. But now Ziegler tells the story. He was a young man working in the daytime, going to law school at night, being in Senator Eastland's office about 4:30 on a Thursday, and said Eastland had one telephone there, that the only people that had that number were other senators and his family. And Ziegler said he was in that office and that phone rang and Senator Eastland answered it. He said, ho, 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 I was just fixing to call you. They had a hard, fast rule that one member never criticized another member on the Senate floor or in committee, and if you were going to do it back away from the Capitol in your home state or wherever, you were going to personally criticize another senator. You told them in advance. Well, Senator Eastland just said, ho, 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 said, you go right ahead, don't worry about it. I was going to call you. I was just fixing to call you. By the way, I'm going down to Mississippi this weekend. I'm going to make a speech, and I'm going to call you a communist. And then he laughed and said, ho, 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 well, have a good weekend. I'll see you next week. Ziegler said the man on the other end of the phone was Teddy Kennedy. And he had called Eastland to say he was going to Boston to make a speech, and he was going to call Eastland a racist. And he just wanted him to know it beforehand, and Eastland said, that's fine, I'm going to call you a communist. Have a good weekend. And I just don't think you have that in the Senate or the House of Representatives today. Now, Walter Mondale was quoted in 1977, near the very end of Senator Eastland's tenure. His last day was December 31st, 1977. Mondale at the time was vice president. He said, Eastland and Stennis have certainly represented Mississippi as great advocates. He said, their doctrine is the 50-50 doctrine. He said 50% for Mississippi and 50% for the other 49 states. Now, it's documented that Mississippi, through these 36 years that Eastland served, Stennis actually served 41. Thad Cochran served 39 now. But during this tenure that Eastland and Stennis served together, for every dollar that the state of Mississippi paid in taxes to the federal government, they got back $3.25. And farmers' home money, farmers' home subsidies, and farmers' home money, the state of Mississippi over that same period of time got 50% of the federal farm money that the state of Texas got. Texas population is 10 times Mississippi, and the farm acreage is 10 times. So these people really did a great job for our little state, but it's a paradox with Eastland, how he could be so effective and so precise and successful in helping people of Mississippi and compassionate in so many ways, and yet on the other hand so opposed to any advance by the Afro-American community. Now, I'm going to read one other word, and I could well, anyway, when Bobby Kennedy said that about you watch them, if we give them the vote, you watch James Eastland change, and Aaron Henry made that statement that after Bobby Kennedy made the statement to Martin Luther King, Jim Eastland spoke little and wrote less, so just how much his outlook adapted cannot be discerned with certainty. What is clear is that and readily apparent, the paternalistic streak that had such a key tenet of his character took on more of a genteel nature. State NAACP leader Aaron Henry likened his metamorphosis in the 1970s on the question of race relations to that of the Apostle Paul on the road to Damascus. He did have a drastic change in the 70s, those last years he was there, and there was a photograph made at Delta Council of Aaron Henry kissing Jim Eastland on the top of the head. Teddy Kennedy said he's got to have a copy. And he got it. I tell you, I've run over my time, but I'll try to answer any questions if you want to answer any questions. But it's, it's like I said, I could talk to dark. Okay, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. That's That's it. But, okay, thank you very much.
If you're interested in purchasing the books, we have some up here for sale. So, thank you.